This week, we're going to do something a little different, and I'm going to share some images that I recently made in Vancouver, Canada with my Fujifilm x100F. Hi, everybody. I've been away for a while. I've been incredibly busy over the last month and haven't produced a video since, but hopefully I'll be back on schedule in the coming weeks. But before I return to my usual critiques of images that people submit to the Candid Frame Flickr poll, I thought I'd take the time and share some images that I've made. And specifically, while I was teaching in Vancouver, Canada, with my friend Olaf Sztaba, we were doing a street photography workshop in one of the most beautiful cities in Canada. It was my first time up there, and it was just a great opportunity to not only teach but also to explore a completely new city and to make some images in a city I'd never been before. And since I'm always talking about other people's photographs, I thought this was a perfect opportunity to share some of my own work, and that's what I'm going to do here. Now, this image happened on the first full day of the workshop, and Olaf and I share very similar sensitivity to light and shadow and composition and color. We hit it off last year. We met in Paris in person for the first time, and we just said, "Hey, let's do a workshop together." And it just gave me an excuse to visit Vancouver for the first time. But it was interesting teaching the workshop along with Olaf because though we have a similar vocabulary and a sensitivity to light and shadow and all those things, we approach photography slightly differently. And the result is, even though we're exploring similar scenes, the images that are produced between the two of us are also very different. And one of the things that Olaf does a lot is work with reflections, and he's often looking at street scenes and taking them to the abstract, not to the way that he's simply minimizing the elements in the frame, but he's looking at how different elements in the scene sort of jive together and result in unusual mergings of all these different elements. And that's what he was showing us with this scene. You can see this sort of glass barrier on the left side of the frame, which is basically a ramp that's leading up to a higher elevation that people were walking up and down. And so he was showing how you could leverage that reflection in order to include the skyline in the background. And on this day, we had beautiful cloud formations in the sky. And he was explaining this when I decided to try my hand at it. And I had just come to compose the frame in the way that I liked when out of nowhere, this kid moved up the ramp close to the barrier there and placed his hand right at the edge, or about right here, and then he was gone, and it was just one frame, and it was complete serendipity because I had no sooner composed this shot, trying to find my frame, when this kid suddenly appeared. And that's one of the things that I stress during the workshop, but that I often talk about in these videos. This whole idea is that when you find your setting, sometimes the moment, that flourish that you need can suddenly appear in a split second, and you only have one or two frames available to you. Other times you have to linger there and you have to wait for that element to show up. And it could be anything. And in this case, it was this kid, and I could never have anticipated him. I didn't even see him when I raised the camera up to my eye to compose the frame. But his presence there completely made the shot for me. Now, here's a shot that's kind of the reverse of that. We were walking down the street, and I saw this series of stairs and these things in the middle, basically these elaborate handrails. And when we came onto the scene, these handrails from the sidewalk were creating a really interesting S curve. And I thought, wow, I can really make use of that in order to create an interesting composition. And I was really working hard to find an angle through which I could make it work. But one of the challenges I was facing, that even when I found a composition that I thought was interesting enough, there wasn't a whole lot of foot traffic. This is largely a business area. So on Saturday and Sunday, there's just not a lot. There are not a lot of people moving about, but they were filming either a television show, a commercial, or a movie nearby, and there was a truck that was loaded with all this equipment, and this fellow carrying this table up the stairs was part of that crew, and I had been at this spot because I realized that the initial composition that I'd found really wasn't working because I was lacking a subject. So I positioned myself here, and I was still trying to figure out exactly what my frame was when I saw this guy coming up the stairs. And I just got myself into position so that I could catch him as he was going up the stairs. And I pride myself in that I got not only the table juxtaposed against the entire wall there, but I got that his legs splayed in the way that I often talk about in these videos. It really creates a very dynamic image or a dynamic gesture in terms of his body that I otherwise would have reduced the impact of his form and the way he moves through the scene. I basically had found my composition, and I had been, for a couple of minutes trying to wait for something interesting to happen there, and he obviously was that. I stayed there a little longer, hoping for something much more interesting, or maybe even him returning later on, but that never happened. Now, one of the things that I was teaching students on my second day was this idea of being aware of your scene, being aware of light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture, but not being a slave to trying to make a perfect composition. So I was showing them how to shoot blindly. Some people will call it shooting from the hip, but for me, when I instruct my students to shoot that way, I'm telling them to still be conscious of all these visual elements, because I think it's really important to not really create an image in which you're just hoping on blind luck to give you a shot. You still have to consider what's in the scene, the colors, the shapes, the lines, all of those things. And when I saw this woman with her child moving through the scene, I knew I would have an interesting shot. And I quickly moved by her, turned the camera, and made this single frame. And I was very grateful that the image was sharp and acceptably in focus. So I was aware of the girl and the doll and the doll that was coming out of the woman's purse. I was shooting at a fairly small aperture in order to maximize depth of field. So I was aware of the other people in the background, but I knew that there's nothing much that I could do about them. But I knew that because I was using the equivalent of a 28 millimeter lens with the lens adapter on my x100F, that wide field of view and my proximity to them would really allow the subjects to dominate the frame. And so even though there are some people in the background that may be a little distracting, I still find that the heart of the image, the center part of the image, holds my attention. The gesture of the hand, the presence of the dolls, the way the woman's right hand is holding the drink, the child's left hand holding the doll, the right hand of the girl feeling the plant as she moves by. And there's some really interesting elements in this shot. So even though the only clear face you really see is that of the doll, and I think all of that, especially the color of her pants, the color of the purse, the color of the dolls themselves, really hold your attention, even though there are some saturated colors up in the right-hand corner. It's a grab shot, but I have to say that I was still aware of as much of the frame as you see here. Now, on the last day, on the second day, we were walking through an area where the light was just phenomenal, and I caught sight of this food vendor. They were selling hot dogs, and I saw how the light was being reflected off the grill onto this man's face, and I immediately knew that there was a shot there. And I raised my camera and I made an initial shot, and I didn't think I had gotten it. So I kept moving in closer and framing it, and being really aware of what was happening at the periphery of the frame. But more importantly, as he moved back and forth and brought the hood of the grill down, his face was disappearing in and out of the light. And so I was just there, shooting every time his face was illuminated by the light, and the light was so slim. And so I must have made about 20 frames, just hoping upon hope that I would get a shot with that light illuminated him. And I really couldn't tell by simply looking at the LCD of my camera. That's why I kept shooting. But when I got home and I downloaded the images, I saw that I managed to nail it on the very first shot. And I love the light, the shadow, the color especially. Even though you don't see his complete face, I think you get enough in terms of his eye contact with me and just the other elements in the frame to make it a really interesting and a pleasing shot. It's one of my favorite shots from the trip. Now, here's a shot that was shot really close to that location. I had stopped at this corner, and me and one of the students were there for easily 20 minutes because the light here was just remarkable. And as the light changed, we just kept shifting our positions in order to take advantage of it. And I had just finished photographing another scene when I saw this guy, this bald head, move from across the street. And I made a couple of frames of him, but then he stopped and he began asking directions of this woman. And I immediately raised the camera and knew that because of the elements that are on the edges of the frame that I would have to go vertical because there were just too many distractions on the left and the right. There was so much foot traffic that I didn't want the eye being pulled to the attention of other figures within the frame. So I immediately made that vertical shot, and what I did is I tried my best to keep that woman's face, especially her eye, within the frame. I actually had to lift the camera a little higher than I normally do in order to get her in there. And her hand kept going up and down as she was pointing to this fellow in what direction he needed to go. And she was actually pushing the person who's in the lower left-hand frame in a wheelchair. So those two are connected with each other, even though it's not obvious in the frame. And this is probably my favorite shot from the entire trip because it has all the graphic elements. It has light and shadow, line and shape, color and gesture. But it has that special something for me that just takes it to a whole nother level. I mean, I took a look at this shot and it was, for me, it just struck me as a shot that someone else had taken. It's so different from the many shots that I've made before. And this is what I call sort of a benchmark image for me. It's an image that I'm going to take a look at over and over again and try to understand what makes it so magical for me and take it into consideration the next time I shoot. I don't think this is going to come easily to me anytime soon, but there's a interesting dynamic that's happening here as a result of the juxtaposition of the different people in the frame that makes this a really special shot for me. And yeah, I was really glad that I managed to capture it. If I had only made one image on this trip, this would have been enough. Well, that's it. I just wanted to show you a few images. I'll get back to critiquing your images on the Flickr poll next week, but I thought you might enjoy some of these things. If you want to hear more about my own process and my own images a little more, leave a comment underneath this video and let me know, and I'll be glad to do it whenever I can. And if you like what you're seeing on this channel, give us a thumbs up, subscribe, and if you've not heard of The Candid Frame, check us out at thecandidframe.com. It's a podcast in which I feature conversations with some of the world's best photographers. We're on episode, I think, 482 at this point, so we're almost in 500, which is amazing. So check it out, and thanks for joining me, and I'll see you next time.